Hey folks, and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting up these minis. These are war machines. We've got a ballista and a catapult from Reaper Minis. Now, generally, these are not the most interesting miniatures to paint. These kinds of war machines, it's really easy for them to end up as just a big blob of brown, to spend a lot of time on it and have it come out looking really bad. But I've got a way to do them that gives them a lot of color, makes them a lot more interesting, and it's fast and easy. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Let's get started. The process starts by priming the minis white. I'm also going to be using a fidget toy as my palette this time around. If you haven't tried that trick, I do recommend it. It's very cheap and very effective. For this method, I'm going to be using express colors and contrast paints, but any of those style products will do just fine. I'm getting out 4 different colors and adding water to each until they're about 50-50 roughly. The 4 colors I picked are Wasteland Brown, Garragax Sewer, Skeleton Horde, and Creed Camo. 3 browns and a green, but it doesn't have to be those colors. I just picked those ones because the 3 browns all have different tone, warmth, and intensity, and Creed Camo is just a really nice, dark, desaturated green. The next step is the one that can probably be a little worrisome until you're used to it, but I'm basically just randomly wet blending the 4 contrast style paints on the model. There's no particular technique to this except trying to vary up the 4 colors. Personally, I like to use a bit less of the green, and I picked Wasteland Brown to be the most prominent of the 4, but none of that really matters. Using the 4 paints together, randomly wet blended, is going to give you a lot of color variation, and it may look a little wild to start with, but you know what I always say, trust the process. Don't worry yourself, it's just paint. If you really hate it later, you can always paint over it. I should note at this point, it doesn't matter if you get paint everywhere, onto the ropes and metal pieces and all the other bits. It's getting painted over later, so it's not really worth the effort of trying to paint cleanly. That's what makes this method so fun, low stress, and easy. You're just putting the paint on and moving it around in whatever way looks or feels good to you. As you can see, the result of the base coat is already looking pretty cool, and you can probably tell where it's going, even if it's still a bit much right now. The next part is going to be base coating all of those thick ropes wrapped around these. I'm saving the metals for last so that we can safely dry brush things without worrying about them. The base coat color for the ropes is Cork Brown by AK, but again, anything you like is fine here. Pick a paint with good coverage though. There are a lot of ropes, a lot of deep grooves in the ropes, and you don't want to have to go over this 4 or 5 times to make it work. The ropes on these are honestly the worst part of the painting process. Boring, difficult to paint, and not very rewarding, but this method overall can be used for any kind of large wooden construct, whether you have these particular minis or not. If it's a ballista or a boat, or even a larger terrain piece if you really like it. So maybe you'll get lucky and your miniature won't have any ropes. With the ropes base coated, it is time for dry brushing. Now the reason I did it this way is because one color is actually good for both the ropes and the wooden bits. Now this is light earth from AK, but any very light brown or even an off-white like Drake Tooth or Pale Sand would be perfectly fine here. And because it's one color for everything we've painted so far, you can just kind of have at it. I'm going with a fairly heavy dry brush over all of this since the wash later is going to knock it back down significantly. Make sure to catch all of the edges and all the tricky inside bits. There are a lot of awkward angles here, but this is probably the most important step, so take your time with it. And now it's on to the metal bits. These war machines are, quite rightly, covered in a lot of metal plates and bracing, and little widgets that are just there to add some visual flair. Now you could go with a darker, rustier kind of metal if you wanted to, but I imagine most professional armies, the kind that have catapults and ballista, are taking care of their gear. So I keep it relatively simple. A dark steel color, a dry brush of a light steel color, and then trusting the wash I'm adding later to do the rest of the work. And speaking of, it is time for that wash. I'm using an oil wash, a mix of black and brown pigments, because that will work perfectly on every part of both miniatures. The reason I favor an oil wash over something like a Nuln Oil or a Strong Tone is because I don't want the kind of surface staining that those washes bring. I want to darken the shadows and the recesses while preserving as much of that color as I can. Using a mix of black and brown pigments together also gives a nice dark shade that looks grungy and dirty in the shadows instead of a pure black. And while I do that, I'd like to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters. You all give a huge boost, not just to the channel, but to me personally, and your support and feedback means such a great deal to me. So I'd like to thank Jason Ashton, Jessica Holden, and Amanda Chisholm for their continued support. It makes a huge difference. Now, if you wanted to, you could absolutely just leave these right here. They're in a spot where they're going to look great on the tabletop, well beyond what I would consider tabletop standard. And they've got a lot of interesting color and variation in them for something that can otherwise just end up as a morass of brown. But I can't help wanting to do just one more step of weathering on them. That final step, once the oil wash is totally dry, is to just take a bit of terrain paste, AK's wet earth, and dab it on around the wheels and a couple of splodges on the lower frame of the Mini. It's a small thing and definitely a little beyond what you have to do to get that solid tabletop standard, but it's easy, and I think personally it really puts the finishing touches on the Minis. When everything is finally dry, this is what I'm left with. As usual, it's the last few steps that really bring everything together and make it work, but I love the final result. It reads as wood to me, but it's also colorful. It has warm orangey patches and mossy looking green patches, but it also looks organic and natural to the Minis. It's also fun, fast, and easy to do. Such an easy, attractive result on models that very easily could have been boring brown blobs. I love it. Hopefully all of you like it too and can find it useful, or at least entertaining to watch. Thank you all for watching, especially if you stuck around this long. Please consider hitting like or subscribe, sharing this video if you know someone who might like it. That is one of the best ways to help a small YouTube channel. If you want to go further than that, there are other links below to Patreon or for one-time donations. Now there is more content on the way as always. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.